Hello, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm one of the co-owners and managing directors with Impetus Digital. And for those people who don't know what Impetus Digital is, my company has built a best-in-class series of collaboration tools that are both asynchronous and synchronous for the virtualization of meetings. So we've been doing this for the past 11 years across the globe. Unfortunately, it's taken a situation like a pandemic where we've had a huge bolus of people coming our way looking to bringing people, stakeholders in the life sciences space together in a virtual way, both synchronously and asynchronously. At Impetus, we believe that everything starts with a conversation. And these conversations are the things that are going to be able to create the big, disruptive, hairy, audacious changes in the various big systems in which we find ourselves. Healthcare is one of those systems. And this is an opportunity for us to start taking a systems-based approach at innovating and thinking differently, getting outside of the boundaries of the boxes that we find ourselves and start to delve into a much more integrative, holistic way of doing problem solving. So I'm also the Toronto lead for the transformative technology community. And this is a global community that is very vested in the flourishing well-being and mental health of people around the globe. In fact, so much so that the mission of this particular organization is to touch the lives of over 1 billion people by the year 2030. So with all of that said, we are here around the table to talk about systems innovations. And we already ran a session last month on an overview of what exactly systems innovations is. And today we're going to be just talking about change, wicked problems, and doing multi-solving. I want to let everybody know that we actually have a resident expert who has joined us today. His name is David Ng. I'm very honored and very happy to have somebody. He's one of the well-renowned thinkers in this space. He's written numerous books, leads multiple groups, and in fact touts the fact he also teaches at OCAD. I'm going to let him introduce himself as well, but so much so that a lot of people don't realize that Ontario is one of the leading powerhouses in systems thinking. In fact, one of the gurus who comes from the University of Toronto, which is Roger Martin. I'm sure many of you have read books on him. He's written a book on integrative decision making and integrative thinking. It's very much built on the premises of systems thinking. So I'm actually going to open up the table, the virtual table, for a quick introduction from the other people around the table. Please feel free to turn your webcam on. I want to make this as much of a discussion as it is reviewing slides. So maybe we can actually start with you, Sean.
Hey, everybody, and thanks again, Natalie, for hosting this. I really appreciate it. So I'm Sean Kearney. I'm the founder of UpGauge. So we are the team hackers. We help teams do their best work from anywhere. And Natalie, I really do need to talk to you more about your platform because I think it's something I'd like to be able to help promote as well.
Awesome.
Also, along with Rick Leander, the co-lead of the North Carolina chapter for Transformative Tech. And a lot of the work that that my company does in particular is based on system thinking as well as design thinking, other types of ways to drive innovation. So again, I'm really excited to be here and I appreciate you hosting the event.
Love it, Sean. Thank you. I don't think we'll go with your name, Bloody Microsoft. Maybe that is your name. I don't know. We'll have to unmute you.
Okay, it's actually Cynthia Webb. When
Hi, Cynthia.
I didn't like that I had to register with Microsoft when I got my latest computer, so I went with that.
Okay, perfect. So do you want to just do a quick introduction?
Well, my background was a little bit in business and then mostly in social work, and I want to create something of my own. I have a couple of ideas, and I'm just excited to learn all about this systems innovation idea.
Love it. Thank you for being here. For anybody else, we're just going around the virtual table to do an introduction. Please turn your webcam on because not only am I going to go over slides, but there's going to be interludes here for discussion. So want to make this as discussion based as possible. So if anybody else wants to turn your webcam, please go ahead. Otherwise, we will go to Manuela if you'd like to introduce yourself. Let's go to Christine. Do you want to unmute yourself and introduce yourself?
Hi, I can't put on video today, but I can speak.
No problem.
So yeah, I'm Christine Circa from Vancouver, BC, originally from Toronto. And my background is from IBM, and had my own have my own coaching consulting business currently, and working mostly in the social innovation space.
Love it. Thank you for being here, Christine. We're going to move over to Gareth. Why don't you unmute yourself and introduce?
Absolutely. I'm in Boulder, Colorado, just getting my morning started here, so I will turn on my video in a little bit.
Sure, no worries.
Gareth Herman. Just getting my morning cacao beverage going. So yeah, my name is Gareth Herman. I'm really passionate about systems change, and I am the co-founder and COO of Magic. We're a performance marketing agency, and yeah, our kind of core purpose is to elevate conscious brands and missions and help them scale their online sales and impact. So yeah, I also wrote a small book called How to Create the Greatest Civilization Ever, and studied systems change and dynamics in college. And so really passionate about this topic and just excited to be here. Thanks for having us.
Love it, Gareth. Super awesome. We will go to Ursula. Did you want to unmute yourself and introduce who you are? And I will try one more time with Melanie, if you want to unmute yourself and introduce.
Hi there, I'm Melanie. I'm from Vancouver, BC, and my background is in cell biology. I have worked mostly as a research technician in areas of stem cell and autoimmune disease. And I'm sort of doing a career pivot right now. Very interested in AI and machine learning. I've been working with a lot of startups, doing due diligence for them, and I'm just looking for the next project to work on. So I was very sad that the conference this May, whenever it was, I wasn't able to go to it. So maybe this time around.
We'll make it happen. Perfect. Thank you, Melanie, for being here. Did I miss anybody else that doesn't have their webcam on who'd like to introduce themselves? David, would you like to unplug? And again, a quick introduction on who you are, because again, we probably could write a book on your resume.
Sure, thanks. So I'm here in Toronto, and there's usually people see me either on one side or the other. So I have one side is I've been active in the system sciences community since 1998, and I was president of the International Society for the System Sciences. I'm outdone actually in Toronto by Elena Leonard, who was not only president of the ISSS, but also president of the American Society for Cybernetics. And there's a lot of other people in Toronto, like Peter Jones at OCAD, who have been very active. The other side that people actually usually don't see is that I was 28 years with IBM doing management consulting, market development work, headquarters planning, and that sort of thing. So most recently, we've actually been running a project out of the Center for Social Innovation. It's at systemchanges.com because people don't think that there's more than one system, and they don't think that there's more than one change, and so somehow they never actually register the domain. So we've been doing that. We've been running a research project for over a year. And also in 2017, 2018, I published a book on open innovation learning, which was part of the research work that I was doing at Aalto University in Finland.
Awesome. Love it, David. Can't wait to have you participate in this conversation. So just to let everybody know the way this is going to be done, this is a small group, so it's discussion based. Everybody can unmute and mute yourself. I will leave it up to you to decide what you want to do. You can use different functionality. You can use the chat function. You can raise your hand. Please feel free to pipe in at any point. The way this is actually going to run today is we've got an hour and a hard stop at 12. I actually have a couple of slides to provoke some thinking, and then interspersed in the slides, I've got some discussion questions. So the point and the objective of this group is not to do a intellectual deep dive, highly annotated, didactic presentation. I don't have that background. I know David does. He'll be able to provide any sort of systematic background if we need something that's a deeper dive. This is more of a high level overview, touch point, if you will, using systems thinking to sort of ponder and pander some of these big things that are going on in the world around us. And so that really is the objective behind this pod session and behind some of the work that I'm doing here with you. So with all of that said, just wanted to go ahead to do a recap of what we talked about at last session. I think many of you were not there. We were actually exploring and overviewing what systems innovation is exactly. David, feel free to pipe in when we get to this discussion part, if this is correct or not, or your own view on what systems innovation is. But really, in a nutshell, it's the ability for us to understand complex systems. So complexity is a whole other definition between what's simple, what's complicated versus what's complex, and the process of innovation so that we can enable transformative change. So it's almost like an equation. It's sort of systems unfolding the innovation associated with that so that we can have transformation. So in other words, it is a bit of a mathematical equation. And that is, we use creative thinking, creative ideas, creative thoughts. Everything starts with a thought, as I was mentioning earlier when I was talking to you about the vision for Impetus. We believe that we bring people together like this to start these big, hairy, audacious conversations. So creative thinking, but the difference is, in a practical standpoint, is we can't end it there. It's not like we just sit in our ivory tower in a room with a bunch of people with same groupthink and pontificate and philosophize and all that sort of stuff and hope that that's going to create change. It's the same thing as creating artwork in your art room or in your studio and hoping that you will suddenly become a well-renowned artist. There has to be a shipping of it to the universe, a shipping of this to the world, almost in some ways a review and approval of that creative thinking in a bigger holistic way with a larger group of people to it truly to be defined as innovation. Innovation in some ways is the practical application of creative thinking in a world that has technically approved or rubber stamped it. And one of the other things that we spoke about at the last time is that one of the ways that we look at this is almost like some of the old physics concepts or laws that we have learned about many years ago in science, and that is, energy is neither created nor destroyed, but simply changed from one form to the other. So I oftentimes like to take the Elon Musk view on this, which is everything that we've ever needed in the world, in creation, in development, already exists. We simply need to take whatever already exists, and what already exists may not be the best use of those things. It might not be put together in the best way, but our job is to take what already exists and break it down into its most fundamental building blocks. And so being able to take the opportunity of reorganizing them into new pieces, so reconnecting them in a new way. So it's a reductionist thinking, and then it's allowing you to build this a new way. So we can reorganize things like our political, regulatory, and legal systems. They already are composed of a certain number of people and things and legislation and protocols and processes. However, the connections may not be the best connections. The building blocks are there. It's our job to pull it all back down together and rebuild something in a holistic way. And so the idea here is to be able to repattern and reconnect. There can be old patterns, but just like a very complex neural network, the way our brain works, for example, the way artificial intelligence works, it's taking patterns and connections and reframing those based on the building blocks that we have. So these are some of the fundamentals, if you're taking it into the most simplistic way of thinking of systems innovation, that we can look at this from that standpoint. And system change is the transformation that emerges when we reconnect these building blocks with new patterns, new ideas, and new connections. But it's really important to make the distinction that when we're rebuilding these things and we are reconnecting things into a new system, say for example, we're coming up with some new legislation around what patient health data privacy means. Or if you're in Canada and you're PMPRB and you're coming up with new legislation on how drugs should be priced in this country, or whatever it is that you're doing, or if you're in Europe, or you're another political leader and you're deciding holistically when you're going to be opening the doors to new businesses coming back in after the pandemic, and balancing that with the needs of health for its citizens, we have to be very careful about when we're coming up with these decisions and these repatternings, is the difference between cause and effect. Because a lot of times what can happen is when we rebuild some of these systems and we come up with these new ways of thinking, we can very easily decide that because of this, this happened. Because this political leader decided that we were going to open business too early, a second pandemic wave actually happened. So there's a direct causal association between certain things, certain innovations that happen, and results. We all know that because of the complexity of systems, that simplistic way of cause and effect can oftentimes get us into trouble. And so this is actually one of the key areas that we need to be aware of when we're talking about holistic thinking, when we're talking about systems thinking. So one of the very first questions that I wanted to open this up to is, as we're thinking about the world that we're living in today, very recently, some of the events that happened with George Floyd as an example, and the huge uproar and the protests that are going on in the world around us, is there cause and effect? So I'd like to open this up for, 5 minutes or so to go around the virtual table, so, for this fairly large, complex question, but any ideas that anybody wants to share on examples that you have seen either recently or in your lifetime where you've seen this cause and effect thinking that has actually transpired, that's got you sometimes either agreeing with it or scratching your head about it. So does anybody want to start?
I can actually start, and I have the benefit of having taught this past term at OCAD, and I usually don't teach there for a full term. I usually just come in for a guest lecture and leave, but this time I actually was there for the full term. And one of the interesting things I saw in getting people to think about systems thinking was that people tend to come at an issue from a problem standpoint. And so particularly since I was working with design students at OCAD, they're all into solutions. And it's like, okay, let's identify the problem. But fundamentally what we uncovered as we worked through the course was they came to understand that what we should be focused on is the first question: what is the system of interest? And from there, you can determine what the systems of influence are. That gets into an interesting discussion, because opposed to looking at, well, what's the problem behind this? It's like, well, what do you mean? Well, what's the system behind it? And how does that work? It changes the perspective. And a lot of the issues that we end up having are between wholes and wholes, not wholes and parts. So you have different groups in different ways participating in the wicked problems, as we say, where things all get mixed up, and so you can't take things apart.
Very interesting. Anybody else? Sean, do you have any thoughts about where in your space you've seen some of this cause and effect thinking?
Yeah, so first of all, David, I'm so excited to be on a call with you, first of all. So it's pretty exciting. I think that answer, that's one that we see every single time that we're doing consulting. So we've worked with over 100 organizations around the world, every size, every type, government, military, small business, startups, etc. And I think the most consistent problem that we see, and I don't want to be hypocritical about this, but the consistent problem is having poorly defined problems, or having problems where they already had the solution as part of the problem description. And the most consistent one that I've heard a lot has been, the reason we're not more successful is because we don't have the right people. Where they keep bringing in people that they might have spent God knows how much money and time trying to recruit. Those people have been wildly successful in other systems. You bring them into that one, and all of a sudden they can't succeed for some reason. So obviously it's their fault. You know, they weren't the right culture fit or whatever. And it's like, if you step back and take a look at why are you consistently having the same problem happening over and over again with new people and new things that you're trying to do, maybe there's something else that you need to take a look at.
Very interesting. It's so funny how we always fall into those patterns, right? And we as humans follow heuristics, which is a sort of a level of automaticity. And again, the brain is we're very lazy entities. We like to conserve energy. And so it makes sense to go to automaticity and go to what we're used to. But this sometimes can get us into trouble because we don't like to live in ambiguity. We don't like to live in cognitive dissonance. So to immediately try to get out of that, we get into this cause and effect thinking. Does anybody else have any thoughts on this question?
You know, one thing I think this is an example of is with the example you mentioned with all of the stuff that's going on right now, is that I think body cams were an example of that, where it was like, oh, here's a problem, here's a solution. If we put body cams on police officers, it will solve the problem. I'm actually for body cams. It's not really the point, but it's, again, I think that kind of thinking is a perfect example of like, oh, here's a problem. If we do this, it'll solve the problem, but it didn't really. You know, I do think it has a positive effect, but I think that's a really relevant example right now.
Very good. Yeah, it is so true and so timely. Any other thoughts? Okay. So one of the things I thought was really important to say here is, based on what you actually just shared, Gareth, you know, here's a police problem, here's how we're going to solve it. We see this all the time for those of us who are working in the life sciences and the healthcare space. As you can see, this is not just an issue in Canada. It's not just an issue in the United States. This is a worldwide issue. The complexities of the system is astronomical. And this probably doesn't even paint the full picture of what's out there. The various organizations and associations, the payers and the non-payers involved, the patient organizations, the accountable care organizations, the distributed physician networks, and the manufacturers, and you know, the lobbyists, and on and on and on and on it goes. So we have to realize that this is an example of a system. And if we went into this and said, you know, especially just using, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic as an example, you know, if we use, you know, the solution is very simple. We are going to have a vaccine, and that is going to solve all the problems of the world, and this is going to put everything back to normal. I think follows very much into this very simplistic thinking. We need to realize that things are beyond sometimes what's the obvious. And so David very nicely alluded to what we call a wicked problem. So healthcare is not the only thing in society that creates a wicked problem. We have to realize that, for example, what is going on in the world right now is a wicked problem. It actually goes beyond healthcare. It has now become a very convoluted political issue. So much so to the point that depending on if you're wearing a mask or not in public, you are actually publicly displaying what side, you know, politically you play on. We're getting to a place now where there's, you know, sides going on about, you know, where you sit, you know, depending on what kinds of social media outlets you're using. And there are so many players and so many things and so many ideas enveloped in this entanglement, if you will. If you think about a ball of yarn, how do you start displacing that? So that's an example of going with traditional problems where it's fairly easy and simple to come up with a myriad of solutions. With the wicked problem, it's much more difficult. Another example of what I'm actually seeing here is we have to observe potential contradiction patterns, or what we oftentimes call archetypes, in these very complex systems. So when we say contradiction patterns, I'll give you a great concrete example. One of the things that we're running in with the COVID-19 situation is people saying, well, first of all, ultimately the solution is going to be getting a vaccine. But until then, we need to, number one, test a whole bunch of people. So how are we going to be able to get that done in a very short order of time and get people doing that? And then the second piece is, once we actually have that up and running and we're doing testing, how do we do contact tracing? So we're getting two schools of thought in contact tracing. You get some of the very conservative people in politics who are overly concerned and worried about patient privacy, health privacy, and security, who are spending millions upon millions of dollars hiring actual people as contact tracers. And then you have other people who are trying to forge ahead with the more artificial intelligence-based applications that, a variety of companies, VMware has actually recently paired up with the NIH in Europe, and they're trying to push out that online contact tracer. Apple and Google are trying to put their process set in place with a whole bunch of people that say it's only as good as its utilization, and people are concerned because of issues around privacy and security. So this is an example of contradiction patterns. It's sort of like, on the one hand, we want to move forward with AI, with technology, with digitization, with digital exponential incorporation, but at the same time, we're contradicting the concept by being overly, or some people may disagree with me on that, but on the privacy piece and around security and what does health data ownership versus sharing mean. So this is an example of archetypes that we've built in the system that we need to be aware of. David also wonderfully alluded to this idea of, we also need to be taking a look at the whole instead of the parts when we're looking at these complex systems. Another local example of this, for example, in Ontario, Canada, is we have been running into a whole slew of issues recently around nursing care, elderly homes, and what is happening in these homes. There's been a widespread, an issue of widespread of COVID-19 amidst some of these most vulnerable in our society. And then also a recent report about how terrible the care has been, so much so that there is an actual task force in place that's investigating and potentially going to be putting a lot of these people into a lot of deep waters because of the issues around the nursing care. One of the things that's really interesting about this process is, again, the cause and effect thinking, or looking at this as a small piece in and of itself of an issue without looking at the holistic problem, looking at the economics behind nursing care and why were these nursing care owners, or if you will, or managing directors or partners, why they were running those businesses the way they were. What is the holistic issue behind this? So one of the things that we continue to run into is, okay, we're going to put a task force on this here. We're going to, make a few switches and levers and bring in, the military to come in and run things until we figure this out, and then we'll pack it away and forget about it for a while. So that is an example of looking at parts versus the whole. The other key point that we need to consider here is that change is also an evolution. We can probably have a whole discussion around change agents and why people are so, and we will, around why people are so averse to change. But considering the fact that it's a process, if anybody has ever heard Einstein talk about the fact that, exponentials was the greatest thing that ever existed, when we're talking about exponential thinking, and we're talking about the power of compounding anything, compounding interest, compounding thinking, it's that hockey stick inflection point. Whatever we see is when we do these small incremental movements that hardly show any change over time, and suddenly everybody notices. This is a great example when people are trying to do small incremental things, for example, of losing weight. And then for months and months and months, you see nothing, and suddenly everybody noticed that you lost weight. And it feels like it happened overnight. Or you see the same thing happening when people determine somebody became a billionaire. It's like nothing, continue to invest, continue to do all these really smart things, and suddenly their company is just, it's a gazelle or it's a Shopify, but it looked like it happened overnight. We realize that this is really, in fact, not what's happening. It's almost like a bamboo shoot. It takes 8 years before a bamboo actually penetrates and grows to the immensity that it does, and nothing is happening before then. So realizing in systems thinking, it's a process. It's not going to happen overnight. And often Peter Diamandis talks about this as being the deceptive phase of the digitization period where it looks like nothing is happening before we see true disruption. So again, it's also, and we also realize that people are part of this evolutionary process. And part of this is the adaptive behaviors that we as people are going to be integrating as part of this process. So you can actually see here as an example of the modification and evolution of human communication, where we've gone from old fax machines, so much so that if you talk to somebody who's in their 20-somethings now, many of them probably don't even know what a fax machine. They don't know what a fax machine actually is. And so can I just have whoever just, if you can mute yourself there, it'd be great. Whoever just came in. We see that we also realize that with this process, we have to adapt. So here's a great example of what's happened with COVID-19. Telemedicine has existed for the last 10 to 20 years, but we found that because people's hands were forced, they had to make immediate adaptive behavior changes. Physicians, stakeholders, patients, allied healthcare providers. This had to happen literally within weeks. So this is actually an accelerated adaptive behavior, but we see these things happening over the course of time. And also, I find that COVID-19 has not only been a change agent, but also an accelerant. So, so that's actually an important piece here as well. So I want to kind of open this up to discussion. If people can actually share in this question, is based on all of everything I just shared, is that we need to look at the whole instead of the parts, that people are part of the equation as part of their adaptive behaviors, that it is a process, and we need to take a look at all of these components. We also realize that there's change, but why do you think people are so resistant to change? And we can probably look at the acceleration of what's happened recently because of the pandemic as being almost a lens into human behavior. Does anybody want to pitch in a thought here?
One thing I'd like to just kick it off with is that, you know, in my studies of systems change, I don't know if you guys are familiar with integral theory or any of Ken Wilber's work, but really thinking about how a system impacts humans or us, and also how we impact systems, and also really thinking about a human being as a system in terms of thoughts, beliefs, emotions, so on and so forth. And really, yeah, I feel like that's not a big enough part of the systems change conversation. Are things like, you know, if you think about a fractal approach to this, you know, what are my beliefs, values, assumptions, biases, and then how does that play out in my family or my business? What are the business values, the business beliefs, or then even our whole culture? And yeah, just thinking more about this concept of culture and values and beliefs, in addition to all the tactical like systems diagrams, maps, and you know, interrelated parts and all of that, and just wanting to weave some of the human element into it as well, because I think it's a both and in terms of our you know, who we are as people and how we run our organizations and how we show up as a culture that has a big impact as well.
I think that's so many important points there, Gareth, is the people component to systems is huge, because you can have all of these set up, but without adoption, which is what we talked about as true transformation, is that you can have the creative ideas, but without it being wholeheartedly incorporated, if you will, approved by a group of, you know, foundational thinkers and people who are going to move the agenda forward, it doesn't really transform anything. I think the other thing that's really interesting about what you said, and I'm a big fan of Ken and his philosophies and thinking, I think it's very thought-provoking work, is everybody has their own sense of reality. And I also love the fact that you brought up fractal thinking, you know, the beautiful nature of us all potentially being fractals and existing in our own space. I mean, you can bring all kinds of things here around multiverse and are we all just living in our own automated simulation? But in some ways, this is the reality, is that my reality can be very different than yours. And then somehow bringing that complexity into this already complex picture makes it really an interesting discussion. Does anybody else have any thoughts about systems and resistance to change?
Absolutely. I totally agree with what Gareth, you just spoke of. Also, I would like to add a little bit of emotional security and fear of change, fear of upsetting what is felt to be the way that people are currently, fear of things being more work, and fear of being embarrassed by not being able to very quickly adopt the new behaviors.
Great points. Fear is a huge thing and a decelerant for moving forward.
I just add one more thought.
And kind of throw in a contrarian point of view, which is, I think one of the reasons people resist change is because it's smart to do that. So I think because we're all change agents, I'm assuming on this call, we assume that we're always thinking, well, why are you not doing this? This is clearly better. Like, why are you being a laggard, or stubborn or stupid or whatever, whatever pejorative term that we use for people who are so-called resistant to change. But the truth is, if you really look at it, we're all resistant to almost all changes. So if we're making a change, we're not changing everything. We're not changing our clothes, our way to work, the people we hang out with, our gender, our language, our nationality. I mean, most of that stuff is going to stay pretty consistent. So I think part of it is, again, this somewhat comes from design thinking too, is to really ask that question thoughtfully of why are you having a hard time with this? Why would you prefer for it to stay this way? What are the benefits that we're probably not understanding? Is it the right time for you to do this? Does everybody have to be on the same page, which is another ridiculous assumption that has no basis in reality. It's just somebody's opinion. So I do think that, I know for me, whenever I'm hearing resistance to change, I want to dig in deeper and find out, well, what's really going on here? Because let's not treat these people like they're second-class citizens or idiots just because they don't want to go along with your idea.
That's really interesting, and I love the contrarian view, and we need more of that, Sean. Definitely more of that, because that actually always brings and illuminates opportunities for continual iteration. Because again, there is what I call the arrival fallacy, and life is just a journey and a process of pivot, change, and part of that is all experimentation. So I like that. And I think that, in the world of lemmings and this concept of altruism is there's always going to be a contrarian, and that just keeps life evolving. Did somebody else have something else that they wanted to bring up here? I heard another voice.
That was me. It's Christine. I just wanted to add in, I think people resist change because they've identified themselves a certain way. So they have a box that they've placed themselves in that they're comfortable with. And any change, or depending upon how drastic it is going to be moving themselves out of that box and possibly changing kind of everything that they're identifying with. So it really, I think the amount of resistance is going to be based on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody else have any thoughts on change, resistance? What is it?
I have another thought, which is in organizations, very often, the people who are to do the change or incorporate the change into their work, excuse me, frog here, they are not in the know on what it is that what the purpose is. And for example, often there's like new paperwork regime or a new process that's put in place, and it turns out not to have been well thought through and results in a lack of efficiency and unhappy workers. Whereas if the workers, well, at least were consulted and if they were in on the big picture, there would be much more an improved cooperation, I think, and efficiency.
I really love that idea because it really speaks to what we were just talking about here conceptually, where instead of going in there and just suddenly plopping something in a bunch of people, you have to realize that part of this process is the evolution and a series of adaptive behaviors. And since we're all human, change is actually an evolution. It's not a here and, and now we're here. You have to allow people to be, like you said, part of the process or adapting to these incremental iterations. Does anybody else have any thoughts before we move to the next couple of slides. So we also have, so I'm just going to move along here. So one of the other things I wanted to share is that part of the complex adaptive systems is that they behave very unpredictably, right? So if we don't go into the system, say, okay, I've got this all figured out, I know exactly if I put this in here, and sort of like putting together a recipe. If I put a little bit of spice here and add one egg and do this and mix it all together, I'm going to have this great meal at the end. I know exactly what I'm going to get. Right? Well, in complex systems, you have to go in with a really, really open mind. It's what I call rigid flexibility, is that you have to go in with the mix and with all those ideas, but be there for the opportunity of unpredictability. And believe it or not, there is actually an equation that the more unpredictable, and if you add in unpredictability with a pattern interrupt, you actually get a dopamine drip from that. So people are looking for things that are unpredictable and that are different all the time, and that actually allows for that dopamine motivation. So another great example of this unpredictability is that we are completely at a loss for explaining the disparity between what's going on Wall Street versus what's going on in Main Street right now with the stock market versus what's going on with economic factors and the huge rate of unemployment right now. So it doesn't match up what we're used to. It's creating cognitive dissonance for us. This is not the way it's supposed to be. Right? So this is a great example of our economic system being this very complex system. And there's probably going to be all kinds of different theories about what is going on. Well, you know, the stock market actually predicts the future. My personal thought is that, unfortunately, what's going on Wall Street is reflective of a lot of things that really don't have anything to do with productivity. They're not invested in stocks that have to do with people's employment. They actually have to be doing with things that are invested in things that are not really high value or not really value generating, things like derivatives and things that are not really real. 20% of the stock market right now is actually completely overtaken by the big five technology companies. So there is a reason why we're moving in this direction of why I think there's a disconnect. Of course, there's many, many other reasons. There's not this equals that. But this is a great example of unpredictability in complex systems. In addition, our wicked problems are global in scope. So the pandemic is a perfect example. Is this hit everybody at the same time with the same intensity? It completely created a reset in the market for all of us, no matter what age, gender, language, you know, what have you, we all got hit the same. So this is, you could not get more global in scope. But we realize that this is also these global issues and systems, you know, global change, economics, you know, the fact that, you know, because of global warming is we're seeing waters rising and potential lands disappearing in the next, you know, 50 years. So there's some really, really big issues coming up for us that are global in scope. And these global issues span from everything from cybersecurity concerns to the global financialization changes that we're seeing, things like Bitcoin and other sorts of currencies. We're seeing things like changes in the use of actual physical money. So you can see Alipay, for example, in China, or social tagging that's happening there, where you're now looking at massive surveillance of people and you know, the loss of personal privacy. And what does that look like? What does that allow you? And what does that disallow from a citizen's rights standpoint? And also things like pandemic preparedness. One of the things I think is really going to be interesting in the next little while is for psychiatrists and psychologists to determine the impact that this pandemic has had on people's mental health. Everything from the levels of anxiety to addiction creation or exacerbation, smoking, drugs, food, alcohol. One of the things that I think would also be really interesting is to determine how the pandemic has affected people from the standpoint of hoarding mentality. We've seen this with toilet paper. I still see this to date when I try to go and buy Himalayan salt off the shopping shelves. People see something that they're worried is not going to be there. You probably all have remembered maybe grandparents or great-grandparents that came out of World War II, and you often said, God, Grandma, why are you hoarding in the basement? Wonder if this is actually going to happen to some of us as well. But the pandemic preparedness is another question that comes up. around these big global ecosystem issues that we're all going to be running into. So I just kind of named a few, but I would love to get people's perspectives on either anything that I've already shared, or if you see some other examples of wicked problems that we are facing today that you think are really going to be something to be managed. Anybody have any thoughts on wicked problems?
Just commenting on some of the examples you've been talking about. We've been on this long arc towards globalization and moving faster for a long period of time. And what I've seen is this trend towards deglobalization and regionalization and moving slower. And I was doing some coaching for some people over at the Center for Social Innovation, and we started this conversation, and we ended up having this discussion about, does it make sense to actually try going slower? And one of the participants there was talking about, he was in a sailing competition, and he said that there were 83 boats starting up, and he said for 14 days, it was bad weather, all 14 days. And when they started off, they just decided that they were going to change their strategy and just survive. And he said only 43 of the 83 actually made it to the end. So I think that some of the presumptions we have, particularly around Silicon Valley, go faster, break things, these sorts of things, we need to rethink those and think about how we might actually be moving slower and more locally.
Wow, that is such great points. Absolutely. Sometimes you need to go slow to go fast. Any other thoughts about wicked problems?
So I have a question about it that I'd love to get your perspective on, if that's okay.
Absolutely. David or myself?
Well, so for anyone really, which is because when we're talking about wicked problems, these difficult or maybe impossible to solve problems, and you were mentioning earlier, because you covered so many different things about how as you start to become more inclusive, more global, you're going to have more complexity, more contradiction is likely to happen as you kind of pull back. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on, given the type of work that you do, how do you help people bring it down to something that's outside of that wicked, where it is something that's more likely? I mean, it's not predictable in the sense of in this complex system that you can guarantee it. I do know that, like, for example, the imposter syndrome is rampant with people who are in leadership positions. And part of it is because of what you just described, which is you have to be confident that you're going to accomplish something that you really can't be confident about if you're sane, right? Especially if it's a relatively big problem. So I'd love to get your thoughts on, like, how do you help people go from taking a wicked problem and start turning it into something where they're more likely to get a better result?
So this is a great question, Sean, so you better stick around for the rest of our program, because this is exactly what we're going to be talking about. But at the end of the day, sometimes you have to take small little pieces, and you have to take little wins as part of the holistic. So it's going into the problem knowing you're not solving the whole thing, you're solving a small component as it feeds in and ripples as a fractal, if you will, of the overarching, always realizing that the small component, and I love the concept of fractals, mostly because I'm a bit of a math geek, but is the fractal is just a reflection of the greater whole. So if you actually can make some sort of a positive change in that smaller piece, then you're actually going to have some ripple effect in the greater whole. So when we actually work with clients, as an example, as opposed to taking the whole big, hairy, audacious problem, is that we will take a look at something that's very exact, very pinpointed, and very timely at that exact moment, and bring it down to a scaled down version that we can do some problem solving. We'll get people around the table, collaborators, physicians, patients, payers, other people around the virtual table to do some solving. And we'll start solving these one piece at a time and start building on them and folding on them and exponentially delivering on these adaptive behaviors. So there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat, though. And this is the thing that's really exciting about complexity thinking, development, and problem solving is it's getting people to multi-solve. And I'm actually going to move into that as well, is realizing that a key component, as Gareth has mentioned earlier, is that people respond with actions that perpetuate systems. So once we start doing some of the problem solving and laying the foundations, So for example, in the Ontario example, we start laying down some new foundations of how some of these elderly care nursing homes should function. We realize at the end of the day, it comes down to the perpetuation of behaviors that people will do and ensue moving forward. Keeping in mind, this has a huge piece around incentivization. How do we actually incentivize people to do the behaviors and to perpetuate them? Is there something that is more holistic? Is it individualized? Are we actually incentivizing the shareholders versus the patients versus the caregivers? What does that look like? And are we looking at this in a very comprehensive and in a continuous format? And also realizing that patterns are going to start emerging and those behaviors are going to replicate. So people in the system are going to watch what works, how to get around the system, how to actually, for example, what we've seen recently, getting away with looting or not, or following the law or staying in, or going out with a mask or not. People are going to replicate the behaviors of people and seeing what works, which doesn't. So the patterns are going to emerge from that and they're going to become standardized. So we have to realize that the net result is not a simple equation of cause and effect. And I think that's the key component. It's really a multiplicity of distributed interactions over time. So I think what David has brought to the table is time is something that a lot of us are saying, let's slow it down a little bit, at least in terms of our approach, and be able to capture some of these different components one at a time to do some mini solving so that the multi-solving can actually transpire from that. So complex problems are going to require multiple interventions. So although I might be helping a client with a small component of their business, Sean, you might be working with a completely different group in that same organization. There might be some overlap in the question, but the solve might be slightly different, but we're going to meet somewhere in there and we're going to have some sort of an exponential repercussion or event or solve in that process. So there's an opportunity for multiple interventions with multiple players around the table. And keeping in mind that all of this is united with a single vision without a specific marriage to an outcome. I was mentioning earlier that we can't be married to this is the way it has to be or it's failed. We have to have rigid flexibility. We need to create the boundaries or the riverbanks around the solve and have this fluidity as we meander in the river to where we're eventually trying to get to. So also it's important here is it's not necessarily based on a single leader approach. As I was sharing, my company might be doing something with an agency or with a team. Sean might be coming in and David might be coming in a completely different way, but we're all kind of going and approaching it from a different angle and coming up with a collective solve. It may not necessarily be the single leader where we, for example, we archetype people like a president or the leader of a sports team. If something goes airy and wrong, we end up firing them. We're just going to end up putting somebody else in the same place who's going to do the exact same behaviors. So I guess one of the questions I want to ask before we sort of close out here is, what does everybody think about incentivization and behaviors in the post-COVID-19 world in which we live? And what can we do a little differently here? Broad scope question, but incentivization. What have you seen? What has worked? And what do you think has caused some problems for organizations or people in the new normal that we're going to be living in?
Just have one quick comment here on this, which is that unfortunately the biggest incentive I've seen for people is their backyard being on fire. And yeah, I feel sad about that because I feel like we have the ability to be proactive, but generally people don't change unless they have a problem that's negatively impacting them right now. And yeah, the one thing that I'm excited about in changing incentives is cryptocurrencies and kind of being able to gamify things with tokens. And yeah, like even within my, any organization or closed system, like, is there any way that we could leverage these like new ways to game behavior just by offering like cryptos or tokens? So those are the only thoughts that I have around this.
I love it, Gareth, and I'm really excited personally about blockchain and about the promise that it holds for the democratization of our data. where when we talk about things like universal basic income, we talk about a world one day that might be automatized or roboticized, is how are people going to generate income? The idea here is that we may eventually get paid for watching TV or playing games by using different kinds of technologies that measure our patterns, our finger tapping, be able to measure neurodegenerative diseases, be able to watch our facial features and our emotions using facial recognition software when we're watching a movie. And we could get paid for every time somebody leverages our data in a database. Somebody using the data for aggregate reviews, population management, health management. So these are all very interesting potential ideas. They're both very scary, but also very promising. Any other thoughts about incentivization? I just really want to leave here as well too that complex problems are very multi-layered, dimensional, and scaled. And multi-solving is going to require a lot of people around the table. We've seen this across the globe with people all over the map getting together, helping to try to solve the COVID-19 vaccine. We've seen a group getting together in the US with a myriad of pharmaceutical companies that we've never seen that before, where they're actually gone past their boundaries of this is mine and I own this and this is my intellectual property, to be able to create a new entity that is actually co-creating something together. And we're reducing the friction in this new complexity solving. So this is actually allowing us, I actually participated not that long ago in a hackathon that was sponsored by MIT, and people across the globe were coming together. There's actually even companies that are now incorporating and starting out just from that particular hackathon. So people all over the place are coming into these open platforms, collaborating, and this is actually what we're needing as well. Any thoughts on this about incremental initiatives before we close out for the day? I know we're actually reaching the end of this meeting, but any thoughts on cross collaborations and incremental initiatives that you have seen in the new normal that we're working in?
Gotta go, guys. Thanks so much. Great to meet you all.
Thank you, Gareth. I actually will leave this homework for everybody. If we do come back to the next session, which will be next month, I do want everybody to be able to share a wicked problem that you're trying to solve or that you're seeing in the world around us. Who is going to help to create the incremental change, and who and what else needs to happen to sustain and build that change. So next session, we're going to want to see examples of wicked problems and ideas around solving. So the next meeting is going to be Tuesday, June the 30th from 11 to 12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. And we're going to be talking about these innovation examples and then talk a little bit around process. So for those of you who are not familiar, there is a Facebook group that's a private group that you can actually belong to. I have actually invited everybody here with their email addresses. I encourage you to participate. I will post the slides there as well as the video recording for this. So if you have any feedback about the format or anything that we've covered, please feel free to send me an email or respond in Facebook. And I just wanted to ask if anybody has any last minute comments, questions before we close for the day. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day. So appreciate it. Thank you so much.